Aloha and welcome to Native Stories. Native Stories exists to share the voices of those connected to the land.
Aloha mai kako. You are listening to Native Stories podcast. Mahalo for listening in. O wau o na nea lo ko inoa no papuklea mai au no au ma kaimuki. I am Nanea Lo from Papuklea, Oahu, now living in Kaimuki. Today we have Camille Kalama, Belina Mai e Camille. This is another episode of what I call the Mauna series, where we're here live on Mokuokeawe or Hawaiʻi Island, holding space in solidarity with the Kiaʻi and protectors of Mauna Wākea, a sacred mountain in the peaceful protest against the 30-meter telescope that has been granted access to be built. Mauna Kea is the largest mountain in the world. And I'm going to give the mic over to Camille for her to introduce herself.
Mahalo. Aloha mai kako. This is Camille Kalama. I'm a Native Hawaiian rights attorney. My ohana lives in Waiawa, Makai on Oahu, and currently up here on Mauna Wākea.
Thanks for joining us. So we wanted to bring to you all a law perspective here for the Mauna series. And Camille is a lawyer and she practices in law. So what led you to law to begin with? I mean, it's probably a long journey, but we want to know your story.
That's a good question, but there's definitely points in my life that brought me in this direction. And I would say, aside from always telling my mom that's not fair, when I was in 9th grade and I was watching it was 1993, so the 100th year anniversary of the overthrow of Hawaiʻi. And until then, I didn't really have a consciousness about our history. And that year, my tutu played a part in the Hawaiʻi song contest, and she was the queen's friend. And for me, that really brought home, what is going on here, and how do we get to this point? And that was really, I can say, the beginning of my consciousness as a Kanaka. A few years later, there was the leasehold conversion of Kamehameha School's lands. And the big issue for me was that, I did not understand how anyone could be forced to sell the land. That belonged to Pauahi. It was given to her by many people for our lahui. And it made me question, what is this system and how can it be used against us in that way? And so that really started me on this journey of trying to understand what the system is that we're living in. How do we get to the point where we are actively affecting change and not just relying on others to tell us what different things mean and what we can and can't do, but we need to understand for ourselves so that we can. For me, it was being able to help our people understand it. And, in that way, if we know what the facts are, we know what the ground rules are, how do we operate within this system? And how do we protect what's precious to us, like Mauna Kea?
Well, I resonate with that because I'm a master's student at the University of Hawaii Manoa, and I'm getting my master's in urban and regional planning. And I kind of had an aha moment myself where I was seeing all these lands and water rights struggles and being what's going on and why are people always getting the short end of the stick when it comes to planning processes, and why do we always have to wait to the end and find out to the end of the planning to be notified? And so I guess I'm a mini you, but in planning. Okay, so how did you even get involved with Mauna Kea and this whole issue? Because I know this has been ongoing for a while. The first kind of big events happened in 2015, and I know you were involved in that. So can you share with our listeners a little bit about that?
Sure. It starts a little earlier in 2010 was when issues on Haleakala started coming up with the Advanced Technology Solar Telescope, renamed the Daniel K. Inouye Solar Telescope. And working at Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation at the time, we fought against that telescope as well, and multiple lawsuits against the process for which it was permitted, against the building of that in this, a sacred space in a conservation zone. And so I had that general understanding of the legal issues. And then in 2015, to be honest, my other half and I were of course aware of the issue, and I had been on the board of Kahea at the time a few years earlier. So knew about Mauna Kea, knew what was going on, but the two of us were not sure at that point what our kuleana was and where we could support. So he was friends with Kaho'okahi and classmates with him, and had been asked to come and support in a different way. And I had been a legal observer in law school a few years before, when the Striker Brigade came through for Lihu'e on Oahu. And so I just asked the question, do you think, would you guys want legal observers, at the next big action? And they said, sure. So that was the first time I came up was in April to really look at the site and what was happening and get an idea of what kind of support I could provide with legal observers. And it was kind of a struggle. I searched around for the Hawaiʻi chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, which is an organization that has really provided legal observation for direct action on the continent. And in Hawaii, in 2015, we did not have an active chapter. So I had called the chapter representative, asked if there were any other legal observers around, and really just and said, do you have training? Do you have anything? And he pointed me to some online resources, basically. So I was able to find a few guides online, because legal observing is not just one organization or one thing, or doesn't involve a license or anything, but it has been done enough on the continent for organizations like NLG to want to have some guidelines so that people representing themselves as observers don't kind of misrepresent what it is and what the function is, and kind of taint what we do when we're in that role. So really, I just did a quick training on the spot the night before on June 23rd in 2015. We had a team of about 10 observers. One was a former public defender somewhere in the Midwest. And everyone else was not a lawyer or a law student. Just people from the community who said, I think I'd be good in that role. And so morning of June 24th, we put ourselves in place, and they did a really excellent job that day.
Wow. I know that legal observers seems like it's a very important role, especially when it can be a heightened experience with police involved and that kind of thing. Can you explain to our listeners what Hapa is? Because you said that you were involved with them. Kahea. Sorry, Kahea.
Sure. Kahea has been around for a long time. They're a nonprofit organization that tries to bridge environment and Hawaiian cultural issues. And Kahea has been involved on Mauna Kea for many years, including as a petitioner in the contested cases over the TMT. So even right now, Kahea is providing financial support for for the camp, as well as some of the legal costs. And so, they've been involved for quite a long time.
Thank you for explaining that. So going back to legal observers and legal observance, what was different this time around in 2019? I mean, I know that I went to one of the classes and it was a huge class. There was had to be maybe 40 people that came out. So did you see a lot more people coming up because maybe they knew more about legal observance?
Definitely. In 2015, our own people didn't know who we were, what our function is. And just to be clear, legal observers are present at things like direct action or protests to observe law enforcement and primarily to act as a deterrent to law enforcement from behaving, unconstitutionally or unreasonably. So, to be very clear, it's not to observe protectors or document their actions. It's really to take note of police and law enforcement, what kind of equipment they use, what kind of warnings they give, what they're doing, and also to support in terms of getting names of people arrested to their support teams, the bail support and everything. So in 2015, to be honest, I was not very organized at the time, mostly just responding and gathering together who we could find the day of and the night before. And then we were, I would say, a little more prepared the next time around, which didn't end up happening because of the court ruling in 2015 where Supreme Court said, go back and redo the process for TMT. So between 2015 and now, I had heard from some law students, actually, who organized a Student National Lawyers Guild chapter. And that was great because they really organized trainings and just called me in to help do the trainings. And by that time, I had done with their po'o, 2 of them, an online video training with the National Lawyers Guild Mass Defense Coordinator, National Mass Defense Coordinator. So that was a little more official than 2015. And so luckily we were able to do those trainings early on and leading up to this. So now we have a lot of people volunteering, a lot of law students especially, others that have been to the training, willing to come up and serve in that role. And I think having a good understanding or a better understanding of what the function is and why it's important. So, now it's like a given. Of course we need observers, whereas before it's I don't know what you do. So, including haleakala. We did some legal observing on haleakala for some of those actions, but again, we didn't have a lot of time to train or maybe not as much interest in the training at the time, Mm-hmm. It's easier now to see why it's relevant.
So what does a typical legal observer look like at an action or a protest or those kinds of things?
So generally a legal observer will be readily identifiable, tend to wear the bright green or bright yellow shirts or hats. NLG, the National Lawyers Guild, uses the yellow hats. And you want them to be visible because the point is for law enforcement to see them documenting their actions. But they also should not look like one of the crowd. So not wearing a face mask or bandanas or political shirts or anything like that. Otherwise, it kind of undermines some of the credibility and objectivity, and law enforcement won't be deterred by their presence. So, and that's important to remember. We talk about if you want to be an observer and you want to play that role, keeping in mind how your actions reflect the group and reflect observers in general. So if you're out there shouting instructions to people or like leading an oli or a chant or something, that may undermine your ability with law enforcement to see you as someone different, to see you in that role. And, there are some folks who plan to get arrested and, want to be an observer for a couple of days and then get arrested. And, one of the things we try to let them know is, that happens. And a lot of people think being a legal observer means you don't get arrested, but it's actually not a special protection. So if the purpose of you being a legal observer is to not get arrested, it's not going to help you. So the purpose, again, is to deter law enforcement and unreasonable, unconstitutional activity. So if you think the same way about how you dress reflects your credibility or objectivity, also your behavior, if you, are in action, you suddenly jump in line and get arrested with anyone else, it can affect, well, for one, your ability to keep observing for the rest of the action. But two, maybe the next day or for the rest of that time, you may not be an appropriate observer because now they're like, oh, you're one of them.
Did anytime any legal observers that you've trained or from like 2015 and now 2019 get arrested? I mean, I know 2019 definitely no arrests, but or any kind of, have you seen legal observers get arrested?
A great question, and actually I have. So not in 2015. Law enforcement didn't really know who we were either, and thought we might be with the AG's office. So they were very respectful, and we told them, this is why we're here. But I did spend a week in Standing Rock in October of 2016, and I was there with other observers, and there was a team that came, a pair, from the National Lawyers Guild, and we weren't necessarily coordinating with them, but one of them decided to go onto the private property easement where the pipeline was, and it happened to be Indigenous Peoples Day, and the action was to build a teepee right on the pipeline. And some of the kupuna, their kupuna and their people decided to sit inside the teepee and not move. And so they were getting arrested. This woman was taking pictures of the arrest, which is something we would normally do, but police picked her up. And she happened to be a councilwoman from Madison, Wisconsin. And her law enforcement officers had been called into North Dakota to help with the enforcement effort. And she was so upset. I just heard from a friend that came from Pine Ridge, South Dakota. He said her officers actually roughed her up. And so she was so upset, she got the city or whoever had loaned those officers to pull them all back out of North Dakota. So anyway, long story short, yes, she was acting as a legal observer. She had the hat on, but she made a decision to go onto the easement. And that's something that as a team that day, you normally decide, like, okay, is it important to us to do something like that where we are breaking the law? But, it's a conscious choice because we want to be closer to make sure people are okay or whatever. So, yeah, she got picked up.
Yeah, that's a crazy story. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so I know there's a bunch of legal issues surrounding the telescope here and Haleakala. Can you kind of explain to our listeners what's involved in all of that? I mean, I know every time I think of law, I think of, oh my God, like, too much information. So I guess, yeah, in layman terms or whatever.
I'll try. When it comes to just the construction of these telescopes, I'm talking about the DKIST now in Haleakala and TMT. There are a number of legal issues involved in that. Now, in this time, there's legal issues with the telescope, but as far as the current action, legal issues with what the government response has been in law enforcement. So I'll try to keep those separate and keep it real simple. But for me, whenever anyone asks me, like, what's the story with, TMT? Why is everybody so upset? I explain that it's really layers of issues. It's not a simple black and white legal issue. It involves our history as a people, our history of land as a people, our national lands. It involves the current state's zoning and what they have said are supposed to be protected spaces. It involves our traditional customary rights and practices. So a lot of these issues, I guess to start from the foundation, when we talk about Mauna Kea, we're talking about crown lands, which are really down more towards the base. And then up at the summit are government lands that belong to our nation of Hawaiʻi. And even the United States has recognized that we as a people have unrelinquished claims to those lands, and they are to be held in trust for us until those claims are resolved. So if you think of from the perspective that at some point we should be able to regain these national lands as part of for our people, we want to know what kind of state are they going to be in. We're concerned about the long term, not 20 years from now, 50 years or 60 years from now, that the TMT will be out of commission already. And the removal and the decommissioning causes significant damage in itself. So it's not as if this telescope will go up and then it can be removed and you restore that land back to where it was. There is really no restoration, no full restoration of the damage and the desecration. So from that perspective, these are our trust lands, our national lands, and what happens to them should involve our free, prior, informed consent as Indigenous people. To move up a layer, if we talk about our traditional customary practices and rights that's protected under Hawaii's Constitution, I think a difficult thing or something that maybe economics and the state and government are not, it's not convenient for them to recognize, is that our beliefs are that Mauna Kea as a whole is sacred, right? And that our practice is really to honor that and not have a lot of human activity up there and not build structures up there. But rather than see that as a holistic practice, the developers, the astronomers, the state of Hawaii wants to try to isolate and pinpoint where exactly are your practices. And they're not in this northern plateau because we don't have evidence of them. And by evidence, we fight with that Western system that looks at man-made structures and things that I would say they feel count in their system. So there is that battle as well. Moving from that layer to the state itself has created different zones where certain types of activity should happen. So you have hotels in a certain place. You don't have them everywhere all over the island, right? You have them in these certain zones. You have industrial buildings, business buildings in urban areas. Mm-hmm. And then you have agricultural zones. That's where the farming's supposed to happen. These mountaintops are conservation zones, and they're supposed to be the most protected of all of, the lands that are here. And so it's difficult to understand that even though there has been an exception created in a conservation zone for astronomy facilities, it should be questioned whether that creates this blanket exemption for industrial facilities in those zones. And that's really what this is. If you look at the building heights for Hawaiʻi Island, I believe the tallest buildings are 8 stories tall on the whole island. And this telescope is 18 stories tall and 2 stories deep into the Mauna. Well, it would be. So you're talking a building nearly twice the height of any building on the island in one of these protected zones. And then I saw the advertiser, Suzanne Case and William Isla, talking about the fragile ecosystems up here and the importance of protecting them, which I fully agree with. But how do you say that with a straight face and also advocate to build this 5-acre, 18-story tall building that will generate some hazardous waste? And, there's a lot of misinformation out there. People saying that we're talking about nuclear waste, which I've never heard. But hazardous waste, yes. And wastewater. I mean, that's why they have to get permits for that. So, again, if you look at it from all these different angles or levels, it does not add up.
And I know that you said earlier you were involved in Hawaii Legal Corporation. And what is Hawaii Legal Corporation, and how have they been involved in Mauna Kea and TMT and the history there? Have they really helped with other land issues like Haleakala too? Or could you share a little?
Absolutely. Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation has been around for over 40 years now and fought some of the biggest cases for Native rights that you might be familiar with, like PASH, which is about access on the shoreline, like Wākea Puna on this island to protect the forests from geothermal development, to East Maui water rights, making sure that kalo farmers in Kenai, Wailuanui, Honopo, all in the eastern side of Maui, have enough water to grow kalo and to continue their practices. So definitely involved in a lot of major issues around Hawaii for our people, but specifically to the Mauna, or the Aina Mauna. For Haleakala, we fought, 3 to 4 lawsuits against the solar telescope, involving process and procedure, but also, the issue of these telescopes being built in areas that our people believe to be sacred and also have practices in. For Mauna Kea and for TMT specifically, in 2015, we did represent a few of the defendants that were arrested, and we also challenged the emergency Board of Land and Natural Resources rules that were created specifically to target kia'i who were on the Mauna, and they believed, sleeping up there near the visitor center. And we were successful in overturning those rules because at the foundation, emergency rules must involve an emergency. And the BLNR had not identified any emergency. So a few Kanaka sleeping at Halepohaku was not, they didn't even identify that as an emergency. So once again, brings us to 2015, where Governor Ige issues an emergency proclamation because kupuna are sitting in the road, and Hawaiians are gathering at Pu'uhonua or Pu'uhuluhulu. our office challenged that proclamation as well. And it was at a hearing on a temporary restraining order. The 3-judge panel determined that Uncle Paul Nevis, who was our client, has traditional customary practices and rights to access Mauna Kea, and it causes him harm, and you could extend that to anyone with those same rights and practices. It causes him harm to block him from being on the Mauna, and required the other side to give him notice when big convoys were coming up and when it would be dangerous for him to go because of that. So, and that's really how it should be, that, you know, the restrictions and limitations should be related to what, you know, any danger there is, which in that case was convoys, and also not overly restrictive and not overly oppressive, you know, to people's practices. And then when it came time to the actual injunction hearing, where the court would really decide if the proclamation should be halted, Governor Ige lifted the proclamation. So right now it's still out there, but it's not as active unless he reissues it. So they're still holding on to that. And there's a few other lawsuits out there. One is by Peter Olson, who's a Hawaiʻi Island attorney. His client is Uncle Kalani Flores, and it's challenging the use of law enforcement from Honolulu and Maui up here to police and enforce on people here. And so, same thing, those law enforcement agencies or departments have gone home to their islands, but the lawsuit is still out there and raises that question of, you know, what authority do they have, different counties, to be brought over and used against the people like this?
Oh, yeah, I know. Oh, and she said 2015, but it was 2019 when she was talking about all that. Yeah, I went to a meeting because there was a kahea that went out for the emergency rules, but they only had practically one meeting on every island. And I had gone to the one that was in Honolulu in Manoa for the emergency rules, and I read over them, and it was crazy, just crazy rules. Like, you can't make a sound that goes more than like 10 feet or even less than that. So it's basically like you can't make any noise because that's noise pollution. Just very minuscule rules that they were either very broad so that if anybody were to break them, then you could be arrested. And most of them kind of sounded like it was strictly only for kia'i and protectors that wanted to practice their cultural rights as Native Hawaiians of this land. So that was kind of weird when I saw that. And I know that a lot of people in the Pai'aina was like, when Governor Ige issued that emergency, they were like, oh my gosh, so he's going to use our funds, like our money, to go to protectors that are just, you know, blocking a road? That makes no sense to have all these resources like the police officers from Honolulu and Maui being shipped up here. So thank you for explaining that to us, because I know there's a lot of people, including me, that didn't know a lot of those things, and you know, now it's answered. Emergency rules. Okay, explain more of that.
Sure. So in 2015, it was the Board of Land and Natural Resources who issued so-called emergency rules that apply at the 9,000 foot level and up within the lease area or on DLNR's lands. And then this time around, the Board of Regents for the university has been working for years on these rules that are supposed to be better management for the Mauna, but end up looking like they're just targeting protectors, you know, rather than being based on good management. And so those rules will come up on August 30th for approval. And if they, you know, there are questions about whether those rules are really constitutional.
Thank you for clearing that up. So do you have any last thoughts that you want to share with our listeners? And yeah, I'll give you the mic for that.
Good question. I think, there's so much to learn here at the Pu'uhonua. There's so much to this issue that really relates, or I think there's a lot of people out there saying, this is really about the larger issues. It's not about TMT. And I just want to make very clear that it's absolutely about TMT. And what it raises in terms of all the issues for our people. So yes, it is, but it's also about so much more. And it's both. It's not one or the other. So encourage everyone to get involved, learn what you can, decide for yourself. But there is so much here that I just never dreamed.
Thank you. So for all the legal buffs out there who want to know, like, how do they get involved for legal observance, or how do they get, I guess, more educated on what's going on, can you kind of point them to some resources or, some social networks or something that they can kind of go to find out?
Absolutely. I think one great resource is Kahea's website. Because they've been involved so long, they have like fact sheets and information that's in a digestible form for anyone who wants like a basic overview background of the issues and the legal issues included. If you're interested in legal observing and want to read more about it, there's resources online at the National Lawyers Guild website that describes the program, describes what is the function, what do we do, and then if you think you want to be an observer and offer that support up here, we have done a few trainings, and you can contact a few different folks. You can contact me. Probably the best way is to email, ckalama@gmail.com. But you can also contact the folks at Kahea, and they are helping spread the word about observers that want to help up here. And then also OHA has provided some support for observers to get up here on the Mauna. So, mahalo.
Mahalo. And that concludes our podcast for today. Please follow us on Facebook and on Instagram at Our Native Stories. And you can download our application at Native Stories and listen to us on podcasts, Apple Podcasts at Native Stories as well. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you later.
Thank you for listening to us on Native Stories. If you have a story you would like us to tell, or want to sponsor a future podcast, location story, or walking tour, please email us at info@nativestories.org.